Freedom is slavery. That's the line from George Orwell's novel 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Those are the official slogans of the English Socialist Party of Oceania. It is the concept of doublethink. That line, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. That is inscribed in massive letters on the white triangle of the Ministry of Truth, the concept of doublethink. And as Orwell elaborates on in his book, with this concept of doublethink, by weakening the independence and strength of individuals' minds and forcing them to live in an environment of this constant propaganda-induced fear, the party is able to force its subjects to believe anything that it decrees, even if it is entirely illogical, such as freedom is slavery. And the concept freedom is slavery certainly seems to be illogical. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. How can you achieve freedom by becoming a slave? But is there a way for one to become free through becoming a slave? Is it possible to achieve true liberty, true freedom, through only having constraints, through becoming a slave? That's what I want us to discuss tonight. If you'll turn over to Exodus chapter 20, a very familiar passage to us. Exodus chapter 20, we're going to begin reading there in verse 1, the Ten Commandments, something we have heard often. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's." Now, we've heard these commandments many times before, and I want us to think about some of those in detail. You know, one of the accusations that you hear often, one of the criticisms of Christianity, is that Christianity is too narrow. It's just too narrow. It cannot reach all people of the earth, in all the cultures that they live in. It doesn't reach them in their diversities, in their stories, in their backgrounds. And not only is it too narrow for saying that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, but it's too narrow in its morality. It's constraining. People describe Christianity, and it's not just Christianity gets labeled this. Judaism and Islam also get described this way as well, as being straitjacket religion that constrains you, it chokes you, that God is taking away your freedom. And people say, I don't want to live like that. Even if there is a God, who is he to tell me what to do? Who is he to direct me how I'm supposed to live? Who is he to control me? Who is he to put me in a straitjacket, to limit my freedom, to make me a slave? And that's the argument that is often used against Christianity now, that it is enslaving, not liberating. And I think we know, if you have spent time in Christianity, that that is not the case. But you can see why people on the surface will make that argument. And after all, in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, we have 613 individual laws that are given. And of those 613 laws, 365 are laws that tell us what we can't do. Thou shalt not something. Now, even with 365 thou shalt nots, God didn't exhaustively list every single deviation from true morality. There's no way that he could, or this will be something that we just could not hold in our hands. The pages of the earth could not contain it. And people will sometimes use that argument, well, God didn't say, I cannot do this, or he didn't say, I cannot do that. Well, he gave us the basis for the types of behavior that we weren't supposed to be living. The Alabama Code has a lot of laws in it. There's a lot of criminal laws within it, too, that I deal with. But it does not include all bad behavior, all violations of morality within it. Nor should it. And a lot of the laws that we have, we probably shouldn't even have some of them. But then, again, there's a lot of times where there may be something that there needs to be a law against that there's not. We see people come to our office sometimes with a complaint that someone has done something wrong to them. And yeah, it's what they did. They have been wronged. But there's no criminal law, there's no criminal statute addressing how they have been wronged, so we can't prosecute them for that. And sometimes there needs to be a law for that, and we'll try to bring that to the attention of the legislature. Sometimes the legislature listens to us and passes a law to try and fill that gap, fill that hole in the law. Sometimes they don't. But we see sometimes those holes there. We have a situation right now. It's come up several times here recently where there's a specific behavior that people are engaging in that really probably needs to be against the law. It's really probably wrong. But right now there's no law against it. And the victims of these crimes, they're amazed by that. They come to us, what do you mean? There's thousands of laws on the books, but there's nothing in the entire Alabama Code that is against what this guy's doing to me? And sometimes we have to just tell them that. No, there's no crime for that. And a lot of times, when that reason is in this particular region, just because technology, with it improving and advancing so quickly, the law has not caught up to some of the things people are able to do quite yet. We had this last session of the legislature did pass a law that did fill one of those gaps, and this current the session that will be coming up, we will be lobbying the legislature to see if we can get another one of those holes filled as well. If you want to know what those crimes were, I'll tell you privately later. But anyway, God gives us categories. He gives us categories. And I think that's part of why the Ten Commandments are still so relevant, still so important to us even today. Because most of these things, most of these commandments, they come up again in the New Testament. Every one of them is commented on in the New Testament. The only one that's changed a little bit, again bringing it to its true fulfillment, is the Sabbath day, which we still keep. We keep it in a different way. It's not a particular day on the calendar, but as Christians, we do have this concept of having constant rest in Jesus. And this past Sunday morning, in our Bible class we have on Sunday morning over in the tea room, Christianity 101, Tim Hatch is teaching, and he did an excellent lesson for us on the Sabbath day and why we don't worship on the Sabbath day today and all that goes into that. I'll just give a plug for that class. If you, we just started a new quarter. Tim's teaching it, doing a great job. If you would like to join us on Sunday mornings, we'd love to have you. But if you look at these 10 commandments right here, these 10 commandments, they really sum up what the rest of that law is going to be about. Of these 10, there are three of them that are given what we call positively. You shall do this. And the 7 others are you shall not. They're given negatively. And we don't mean that they're meant to be negative. We just mean that there is a no that's included in there. You can't do this. You shall not do this. Now, the shall not would not be there if there was not an option for moral choice. And obviously, God has dealt with mankind enough by this time that he has seen the types of ways that man's heart goes astray. And obviously, God has seen murder. We read of it before this command is given. Cain murdered Abel. We read of stealing. We read of coveting. We read of adultery. We read of these other sins. And really, a lot of these stories in the Old Testament are not so much there to show us, what you shall do. Imitate this person in how they did things or didn't do things. Sometimes that's there, and sometimes that's there to encourage us, but a lot of it's there just to show us what happens when you make the wrong choice and the path that wrong decision you made leads you down. We see that a lot of times from motivational speakers today. I remember when I was in school, we would have motivational speakers come talk to us about things, and a lot of times they would talk about, I made this bad choice, and these are the consequences that resulted of that bad choice I made. And that they do that in order to prevent us from making those same bad choices that they made. And so you find that with story after story, character after character throughout the Bible. And even with all those character flaws, those people can still be saved by God's grace. And that's one of the great themes of the Bible. But again, we have these negations or prohibitions, 7 of them right here in this text. Now, the 3 commandments that are given positively here, they have to do with either your commitment to God or your commitment to the human family. You shall worship the Lord your God. You keep the Sabbath. You honor your father and mother. These have to do with your relationships. Your commitment with God or with those people around you. The 7 prohibitions are showing us actions that would be violations of neighbor love. Here's what I mean by that. Later on, you remember Jesus is going to be asked the question, what is the greatest commandment? Of all these 613, what is the greatest? And you remember Jesus' answer. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind. That's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And so he says, that's number 1. And he says that the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We find that in Leviticus. And he says really all 613 and everything else surrounding the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Now, if you think about the 10 commandments, really every one of them is connected to those 2 ideas. It's something to do with love of God or love of your neighbor. And all the prohibitions are ways that you would violate that love for a neighbor. If you steal from a neighbor, if you steal from me, you are not loving me as your neighbor, as yourself. If you murder me, obviously, you are not loving me as yourself. You have violated that concept of neighborly love. And just as an aside, bringing up murder, something happened this week that I just got to tell you about. An attorney walks into my office, and he comes in and says, Josh, I'd like to talk with you about a case. Okay, could we come back? You sit down. And he begins talking to me about it and says, this is a particular case I'd like to try to work something out with you on, see if we can come to a plea agreement. And he mentions to me the fact that the victim in this particular case has died. And I think, okay, I'm thinking, well, it's probably maybe a theft case, something like that. I mean, that happens. These cases can drag out a while. If the victim dies, then in a theft, there's not a whole lot that we can do to prosecute that case without the victim being there. But then he gives me the name of the defendant in the case, and I type it in the computer and plug it up. And the charge is murder. And I looked at it, I was like, thinking, you got to be kidding me. And he seemed to be serious. He didn't seem to be there joking about it. But, I mean, murder cases, the victim is usually dead when we prosecute a murder case. And after he left our office, the whole office got a really good laugh out of that. But another one of them is coveting, talking about neighborly love. If you covet what belongs to someone else, that's not neighbor love. That's not respecting their relationship. It's not respecting their property. You can see all of these have to do with either loving God or loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, why so many? Well, sometimes we need to be told more of the specifics, more examples. How does this play out in my life? I know you've told me to love God, to love my neighbor. Now, what does that mean for me? I think that would probably be what they're asking. God's actually doing them a favor. He's giving them how he expects them to live this out. But someone who is new to faith, and they come to this, and they've been living life under their own control. And they like that control, and they don't like the idea of submission to a higher Lord. They don't like the idea of conforming to a vision that God has for that self. And they come to a passage like this, and they say, God, who are you to tell me what to do? And who are you to tell me what I can't do? In the courthouse that I work in the bathroom, the custodial department has put up a sign that says, please do not spit gum or tobacco into the sink. And somebody has taken a pen and written up underneath that sign, don't tell me what to do. Don't we all go through that at some point, particularly in our childhood? You're growing up in a house whenever your parents lay down a rule for you, and to you don't understand it, and it just seems silly, and you just say, who are you to tell me what to do? Or maybe you don't actually say that, hopefully you don't, but you think it. You think, who are you to tell me what to do? We don't like prohibitions. They go against our nature. We want to be in control. I want to have the control and the direction of my life. I want to have that freedom. And a rule like a curfew or something like that puts limit on my freedom. It constrains my liberty. Putting limitations on what I can and can't do, that frustrates us. And I think a lot of people, they come to faith and they're exploring faith, and it frustrates them because they see this idea of having a spirituality. They want to have some type of spirituality, but still being in control, still being able to live my life the way I want to live it. Do all that I want to do, direct my own paths, but then still claim some type of spirituality with that. That's what seems to be popular now. And it's easy, isn't it, to find ourselves falling into that trap. So what do you think? The 10 Commandments of God, are they constraining? And why? Why thou shalt nots? And why so many of them? Is God just trying to take away our fun? Is he trying to take away our freedom? Is he trying to just make us into one little mold? And would a good God do that? Let's explore that for a moment. So what do we mean here when we talk about freedom in this context? Freedom is that which allows one to find and enjoy one's true nature. The ability to conform to the reality of the true self. Now let's illustrate this. Let's take a fish. Think about a fish. A fish is designed to thrive, and really even just to survive, in an environment of water. Now that sounds like constraints. It's boundaries that fish must live in if it is going to thrive. That's a boundary. That's how God created the fish. Your boundaries are the water. Saltwater fish, you better stay in saltwater. Freshwater fish, better stay in freshwater. If you deviate from that environment, you are not freeing yourself. You're not liberating yourself. You're going to end up destroying yourself. Now you take a fish and you say, fish, I am going to give you more freedom than you have ever had. I am going to take you out of the water, and I'm going to set you over here on the grass, freeing you from all those constraints. What's going to happen to that fish? It's going to flop around. It's not going to know what to do in that environment. That environment is not conducive to its true freedom, to its true liberty. True liberty for that fish is to be where it is supposed to be. It's conforming to its real nature in the water. So we may think that we are giving that fish more freedom, that we are liberating the fish, but actually we're destroying the fish in the process because we're not allowing it to be its true self. Now, no analogy is perfect, but let's think about this and coming back to us. Is it possible that part of why God is putting these constraints as we see them, these prohibitions on where not to go, is because we are like the fish? He has created us with a nature, our true self. And He alone knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows the environment that we are going to thrive in. He knows the nature, the behavior, where we are going to thrive, and therefore He says, you're a fish. I want you in the water, not on the land. I want you to conform to your real nature. I'm going to show you that real nature, your true self, because your true self is actually what is liberating, what is going to keep you. Because a fish on the land is a slave. He's going to die there. He's not liberated to do what he wants to do. He's outside of his freedom. Only in the water can that fish be truly free. Now let's bring it to us and think about this. These constraints are God trying to keep us in our true environment, where we are going to thrive, where we are going to be able to live within our true selves. We don't see it. We want to be in control. We want to define what is my true self, what is the reality that I want to live out. And yet God has a better idea of what that really is. Let's use another example here to talk about this concept of what sometimes seems like it is a straitjacket is actually what is freeing us, what is liberating us. Think about the very concept of love. Now, when I say love, I mean the relationship between a husband and wife, the relationship between a parent-child. We'll take, first of all, those two examples. There's a lot of examples that we could take, that we could think about with this, but let's take those two examples. Husband and wife, parent-child, core, really, to being a human being. When you enter into a marriage relationship, is there not some sense in which you give up some freedom? You better be willing to, because you are no longer your own. You belong to your spouse belongs to you. And so where I used to be to find more of what I did in my own time, or how I used to set my own schedule, how I spent money the way I wanted to spend it, how I lived life just the way I wanted to live life. When you get married, you give up some of that freedom. I'm probably going to get in trouble tonight with some of this. But by the way, Courtney may have an anniversary coming up in a few days. It's be 9 years, 9 wonderful years, right? But that's the point. The point is this: it's in a relationship like a marriage, a true love relationship where human beings are the most free and the most alive to be themselves, to thrive. Think about a parent-child relationship. Those of you who are parents, did you not give up some freedom when you became a parent? Is that not constraining in some ways? I mean, you have more obligations, you have more responsibilities. The way you spend your time, your priorities, all of that changes. There's a lot going to change in either a marriage relationship or in a parent-child relationship. And there's a sense there of a loss of freedom. There's constraints there. There's a new obligation that's there. And that may seem, yes, like it is less free. But it is in those relationships that you end up valuing the most. It's where you're most free to be your true selves, is in relationships of love. And I'm not just saying that's in a parent-child relationships or in marriage, but in any kind of relationship as Christians with one another. I'm not at all saying that if you're not married or if you're not a parent that you're not experiencing ultimate freedom or living life to the fullest. That's not at all what I'm saying. I use those two relationships just as examples to apply to any kind of relationship Christians have with one another. We are obligated to one another. And that's obligation. That sounds like there's a sense of freedom that we're giving up when we enter into a relationship with one another in Christ. But again, that's where we find our freedom. That's where we find liberation, when we become our true selves. And that's the whole point that we're getting at tonight, is this, that God is actually liberating us from slavery. He's liberating us from slavery. Now think about that. That language of liberation that we see come up time and time again throughout the Bible. The people of Israel, they are in slavery. They are in bondage in Egypt. And God raises up Moses, and Moses comes and leads them out into their promised land. It's a great story of salvation. And now again, they've come out of slavery, and yet now they have 613 individual laws that they're required to follow. Does that sound like freedom? In God's mind it is. He's trying to set up a society where they can thrive, where they can become their true selves, where they can look out for each other, where it's not just me seeking my own freedom and you seeking your own freedom. No, real freedom is where we're seeking the way of each other and we are thriving in that. That's where we're finding our real environment. We are fish that have gone from being on the land, flopping around, gasping for air, to being placed in our true environment where we can thrive. That's what God's trying to do. Now let's think about some of these concepts that we struggle with, that are not wrong in and of themselves. And I'll just throw out some examples here. Money, not wrong. Not wrong in itself. If you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life yet this season, there's a scene in there where George Bailey, and he's talking with Clarence, and they're talking about money comes up, and Clarence says, "Oh, we don't use money in heaven." And George says, "Well, it comes been pretty handy down here." Money, not bad in and of itself, but yeah, it can be dangerous when used inappropriately. Power, same thing. Not always bad, but power can be very dangerous. Sex, not bad, but used inappropriately can be very dangerous. Drugs not always bad, sometimes very needful, very helpful, but when used inappropriately, very dangerous. And you know how enslaving each of these can be. Money, power, sex, drugs. You know how many people can fall prey to becoming a slave to any of those. You know, my boss often says, 99% of the crime that we prosecute involves money, power, sex, or drugs. And if you took away people misapplying those things, I would be out of a job. And we see it so many times. These are some of the greatest idols that we face around us in our world today. But think about this. Think about any of those. If God had said, all right, money, power, sex, drugs, you go do whatever you want to do with those. No limitations, no boundaries, no constraints. You handle it however you want to. Is that a world you want to live in? Is that freedom? Is that a world of liberty? And yet that is so much of what a worldly mindset seems to want. But do we really want that? Let's take the idea of power. Wasn't our own American governmental system set up with 3 separate branches of government? And wasn't that done for the separation of power? To have some type of limits on power? Constraints on power? Some checks and balances there with power? Because when we look at history, what happens when those are in power, and particularly when those who have absolute power. You remember the words of Lord Acton, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So having some constraints on power, it actually allows for greater liberty. That's one of the founding principles of our nation. Not saying we have a perfect nation by any means, just saying that is one of the premises, one of the principles of American government, that you have greater freedom when you place some constraints on power. Now think about that in this. God is giving us greater freedom when it comes to issues like money and power and sex by putting some constraints on that. By saying, don't commit adultery. Be faithful to your spouse. Live in that relationship. And that's where you're going to thrive. That's where you're going to find your true self, and is where you are committed to that one person. He's going to say, don't steal from someone else. That's a violation against that person, against their property, against their freedom. So it may feel like it's liberating to me if I steal from my neighbor, but really, it's not liberating to the person I stole from, and actually, it's not liberating to me either, because I then become a slave to it. So any of these, you take any of these prohibitions that God gives us, He's actually giving us constraints that lead to our liberty and the liberty of those around us. He's giving us the right way to treat each other, the right way to live, the right environment to live in. And so, I know it's kind of hard to grasp because, it's a paradox. God gives us constraints that actually liberate us. But that's part of the Christian faith. That's part of the mystery that we have given to us. God is showing you your real nature, your true self. Not the self that you think you want to become, the self that He has a vision of, and that He knows you can become through His Son Jesus. Now think of that. God was in Christ reconciling the world to Himself. The Bible says that repeatedly. Think about that. God became one of us to show us what humanity could become, what we had the potential to become if God is living in us. Now that's giving us our true freedom. Isn't that what Jesus said in John chapter 8? Everyone who sins is a slave to sin, but I've come that you may know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. His teachings set us free. They're liberating. And what do you mean they're liberating? He tells us that He is concerned about all the minute details of our lives, even the thoughts that we think. How is that liberating? Because if you buy into it and you live it, this is your environment where you're going to thrive. This is how you're going to become your true self, and that's the whole point. The true self that God is trying to lead us into becoming is to conform to the image of His Son. Now, people say, Christianity is too narrow. It's not diverse enough. No, Christianity celebrates diversity. It does. Christianity is the one true faith that is the answer to the diversity. To the cultural diversity around the world, it is the one faith that has actually thrived in multiple parts of the world and at different points throughout history. And you think about it, the geographical center of Christianity, it has shifted throughout history because it appeals to different cultures. Every culture finds their answer in Christianity, and you've seen that. Unlike any other religion in the history of the world, Christianity's center right now, it's in Africa. Where was it 100, 200 years ago? It was here in the United States or in Europe, where it has been for centuries. Prior to that, it was in the Middle East in the time of Jesus and the Roman Empire. Its center shifts. Why? Because it appeals to different people and different cultures unlike anything else. It is not too narrow. What God is saying is that culturally, this is for everyone. Morally, though, there is one true self. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have different talents. We do. God celebrates our different talents. You read about this in the Bible. Some of us are a hand, some of us are a foot. Some of us can get up here and lead singing. Some of us, hand raised, will never be able to do that. Some of us struggle when it comes to personal evangelizing, talking to people. That's hand raised. I struggle with that. Some of us, that comes easy to us. Yeah, we have different talents. We work in different ways. There's diversity there. That's great. But morally, ethically, there is one true environment for us to live in, and that is the environment of Jesus. It's Him. It's conforming to His image. We talked about that last week, didn't we? The image of God was the ultimate image of God. It's Jesus that we are trying to conform to. Turn with me, look at a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. There's two passages in 2 Corinthians as we wrap up. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, because I want you to see something very important here. I know it's a passage we can spend a lot of time in, go a lot of different directions, but I want you to see something at the end of the chapter. Jumping in, just pulling a couple of verses out. just in the context here, it's talking about how the new covenant we have through Jesus. And yes, a covenant has constraints. It has regulations that come along with it. It has direction. God's trying to point us in a certain direction. And yes, even through Jesus, our covenant has that. Keeping his commandments, keeping his teachings. It says if we love him, we'll keep his commandments. That's where freedom is, in keeping Jesus' commandments. Look at verse 17. It tells us this. It says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And before we go any further right here, we have this idea of the Spirit of God, which comes up a lot in 1 and 2 Corinthians. He's saying that there's such a close relationship between the Spirit of God and Jesus Christ because they're both God. They're both part of the Godhead, and he's saying that there is such a connection right there, and they both represent parts of God that are connected with you personally. Jesus is God become human. God's Spirit is God who then dwells within the human heart. So he's saying that first off, and then he says this, where the Spirit of the Lord is, that becomes your body, that becomes your sphere, your environment is where God now lives. You and him, and he and you, and he says this, where the Spirit of the Lord is, if he's truly there, there's liberty. There's freedom. He's setting you free. He's not there to constrain you. He's there to set you free. Now look at verse 18. But we all, with unveiled face. It's a reference back to Moses. You remember when he encounters God. Moses doesn't even encounter him face to face, just sees his back, and yet he comes back and his face is glowing. And he has to wear a veil over his face. Paul says we have greater access than Moses ever did to God. He says, we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. Think about that phrase, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. That means when you look at your reflection, who you're becoming as a Christian, you should be seeing the glory of the Lord there. Beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord are being transformed into the same image. And then we have this phrase, from glory to glory, which perhaps is best translated from one degree of glory to another, meaning that this is a transformation process that God has begun in us, begun in our soul, transforming us, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. And don't miss the main point here. He's saying that as you grow as a Christian, you look in the mirror and you see yourself transforming into the image of Jesus, the image of how a human being is supposed to look, of what a human being's true nature is, what our real nature is, and that's Jesus. Jesus came to show us how to thrive as a human. So when you read the life of Jesus, you read the teachings of Jesus, you're reading someone who is living the best possible life a human being could ever live. And you say, well, how is that? Here's a guy that just comes and gets himself in trouble. He comes and gets himself killed. He's living the most fulfilling life a human being could ever live. It is a life completely devoted to love of God and to love of his neighbor as himself. And that's what it's about for us. That surrender of control to him. That conforming to the image of Christ. That's where we find our true liberty. It's where we find our freedom. It's where we find our true selves. It's where we find joy. That's what God's trying to get across. One more passage briefly. I know we're just about out of time. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He's going to say, now as Christians, for the love of Christ, and then some translations actually say, this is in verse 14, constrains you or controls you or compels you. Now the idea is that once you're a Christian, your identity is so wrapped up in who Jesus is, you're becoming like he is. Yes, we have diversity in our cultural backgrounds and in our talents. Our character should all be merging into one. And that's this idea of what Jesus is by character. We're all becoming one like him. And it tells us that his love controls us or constrains us. Now that sounds like straitjacket Christianity, doesn't it? It puts you in a straitjacket. It controls you. But look at what he's saying. Again, love. What do we say back at love about the beginning? To be in a love relationship is where human beings are the most free and the most alive. That's what Jesus is saying. You're in his love. You're in his love to the point where it's constraining you, it's controlling you. And it goes on to say here, the conclusion is, having concluded this, that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all so that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. Now look at the next verse. Therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh. Yes, we have different genders, different racial backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, we're different ages we bring to this. We're different talents, a lot of diversity. But guess what? Where we're all the same. We're all becoming like Jesus in the way that God is transforming us. So it says here, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. Old things have passed away, behold, new things have come. And the new things, the vision God has for your true self that he's trying to give you. And so anything that God says to us, yes, his teachings are difficult. They seem to go against our human nature. But God's whole point is that because we sin and we live in this fallen human nature, he's trying to restore us to what was the original human nature, the true selves that he's transforming us into. And that's someone who looks and lives like Jesus, God in the flesh. And that's where your liberty is. It is liberty through constraints. Freedom is slavery.